Hey guys, it's Brian. Welcome to Financial Fitness. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. In today's video, I'm going to talk about emergency funds. So what is an emergency fund and should you have one? I'm going to go over what it is, why you need one, how much you need by showing you an example, when to use it, and some drawbacks of an emergency fund. Let's get started so you can find out the details. What is an emergency fund? The purpose of an emergency fund is in the name, and it is to have money available to you in case of an emergency. This would cover essential expenses like a last-minute car repair, fixing a leaky roof, an urgent care visit, sudden pet expenses, or unanticipated travel in case you lose your job. Why do you need an emergency fund? When I looked up some articles on emergency funds to find statistics, the details were shocking to say the least. I'll put the charts at the end of the video in full screen as well so you can see them all sequentially. CNBC said in a 2019 article that roughly 40% of Americans would struggle to come up with a $400 sudden expense. And a separate report from bankrate.com revealed some eye-opening statistics that 26% of all Americans have no emergency savings at all. And if you think about what the average cost of an emergency expense is, 71% of sudden expenses is over $1,000. 4 out of 10 American adults would need to borrow money to cover an emergency expense over $1,000. In addition, here is a chart from Bankrate that shows the number of months worth of expenses that can be covered using money in a checking, savings, or money market account from people who responded to their survey. Here's another that shows how they would cover the expense. You don't want to be the 4 out of 10 people that isn't prepared for an emergency expense. With those kinds of numbers in mind, if you didn't have any money set aside, where would you look first for money? A sudden car maintenance expense comes up, or even just buying a new phone in the case of losing it or breaking it. If you don't have a really good answer for this, then you should think about starting to set aside money for an emergency fund. Your savings should not be an emergency fund. Probably the first place that many people turn to is credit cards if savings are not an option, and that could affect your FICO score, especially if you can't make the minimum payments once you charge your emergency expenses on them. Also, you wouldn't want to pay double-digit interest rates on something that you easily could have set aside already through an emergency fund. Even if you have an emergency fund, would it be enough to cover more than one sudden expense at a time? My theory is that sometimes when things happen, the timing seems to be kind of all at once, so why not try and prepare, if possible? How much money do you need in your emergency fund? Now, the concept of saving up to create an emergency fund can take some time, but will help your finances feel more stable depending on if anything comes up to surprise you. It requires discipline to build an emergency fund, and one method to ensure that you start to create yours is to open a separate account and make automatic deposits to it so you don't think about it too much. That way, after several months, the automatic deposits will turn into a partial, if not full, emergency fund depending on how much you set the deposits to be. As far as how much you need to save up, that does vary based on your situation. Most financial experts would say 3 months of your fixed expenses would be a good emergency fund, and so I generally agree with that as a bare minimum, but I think that 4 months is a better starting point for your total fixed expenses. 6 months would be even better and probably the best. Although 6 months is likely hard to attain, and some might wonder if it's worth the effort to have that much money sit on the sidelines earning so little interest, but more is probably safer. So my reasoning behind saying a minimum of 4 months is that if you were to lose your job and have to find another one, it would take a few days or even a week to start searching and finding jobs to apply for, then a couple weeks for the interviews to be scheduled and completed. Under an ideal scenario, you'd be able to complete the cycle in about 1 to 2 months, but in case you either don't get as many interviews as you'd like, or just want to look around for a job that is closer to what you have expertise in, or closer to what you're looking to do, these things take time. And your bills do not stop coming even if you do not have a job or income. If you do not have a job, it's typically harder to find a job than if you already are working. So mainly that's my reasoning why I'd say 4 to 6 months makes sense from the standpoint of if you lose your job. Do not underestimate how long it may take when finding a new job is not entirely in your control. The only factors you can control are your resume, which jobs and how many jobs you apply for. Whether they hire you depends on the candidate pool that also applied, regardless of how well your interview goes or how good your resume is. Alternatively, it could also be an extremely short cycle depending on what the job market looks like when you're applying for work. To figure out how well your emergency fund works, stress test it based on your financial situation and adjust accordingly. Simulate several expenses simultaneously and whether your emergency fund can handle it based on the types of expenses that you think you might pay for or have come up in the past that caught you by surprise. Save accordingly to create your emergency fund based on how many months you want to be prepared for. Here's a simple example using 4 to 6 months worth of monthly expenses. Monthly expenses of $1,500 times 4 months is $6,000. $1,500 times 5 months is $7,500. $1,500 times 6 months is $9,000. When should you use your emergency fund? As for when to use the emergency fund, use it just for emergencies like medical expenses, vet bills for your pet, car expenses, home repairs, and if you lose your job. You can create a list of acceptable expenses that your emergency fund can be used for to make sure you stay on track. Do not be tempted to use it as disposable income, such as for vacations or a down payment on a home, just because it's readily available. This is not meant to be disposable income, so don't use it that way when you don't have to. Another way to make sure you stay on track when you create your emergency fund is to set up automatic deposits into an account that is not linked to your debit card or checking account. Drawbacks to emergency funds. Up to this point, I've only mentioned how useful an emergency fund is, but I felt like I needed to mention the main drawback. There are many different opinions on how crucial an emergency fund is for various reasons. I think it's important to have access to money in the form of an emergency fund, but there is one major flaw with it. The problem, in my opinion, with an emergency fund is that the money is sitting around with no other value to you than basically just being available. This means that if it's sitting in a checking or savings account, there will be almost no interest or low interest that you're getting on the money, and it won't be working for you. To strike the best balance between availability and having your money work for you is to try and have the money liquid, and that usually means achieving a lower interest rate. So what I do is put it into a brokerage account and get the money market rate, which is still higher than a normal savings account interest rate, and I can pull the money out at any time. Another option would be to put it in a high yield savings account. That way it can still gain some value in the form of a little bit of interest, but it's still accessible to you in case of a sudden expense. This gives you the best balance of having it work for you at least a little bit, and that it's available if you need to use it on a sudden expense. The age-old question of saving versus paying off debt. Which comes first? A financial rule of thumb is to prioritize paying off high-interest debt first. However, if you also do not have an emergency fund that can potentially put you right back into debt if a sudden emergency expense comes up by not having an emergency fund. So the best balance is to pay off high-interest debt and create your emergency fund at the same time. With your money in a given month that you have budgeted towards both paying off high-interest debt and contributing to create your emergency fund, divide about 75% of it towards paying off high-interest debt and 25% towards creating your emergency fund. So the best balance is to pay off high-interest debt and create your emergency fund at the same time. With your money in a given month that you have budgeted towards both paying off high-interest debt and contributing to create your emergency fund, divide it into about 75% towards paying off your high-interest debt and 25% to create an emergency fund. For example, if your budget for this category is $1,000 per month, pay off debt with $750 and the remaining $250 save it to create your emergency fund. As I mentioned earlier, here are the charts from the beginning of the video for why you need an emergency fund that I mentioned I'd include here so you can take a closer look at the data for yourself. Get financially fit and be prepared just in case. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you liked this video and found it insightful. Click the like button if you did, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notification bell so you can see when I post videos next. Feel free to leave comments, questions, and any topics you might want to hear about in future videos to get on track to being financially fit. See you in the next video.